Welcome to Windy Night Stories. Tonight we have two stories. They're not related, except that they're short. The first is by Alfred Noyes, Midnight Express. The second is unattributed, The Invisible Hand. Midnight Express. It was a battered old book, bound in red buckram. He found it, when he was 12 years old, on an upper shelf in his father's library, and, against all the rules, he took it to his bedroom to read by candlelight, when the rest of the rambling old Elizabethan house was flooded with darkness. That was how young Mortimer always thought of it. His own room was a little isolated cell, in which, with stolen candle ends, he could keep the surrounding darkness at bay, while everyone else had surrendered to sleep and allowed the outer night to come flooding in. By contrast with those unconscious ones, his elders, it made him feel intensely alive in every nerve and fiber of his young brain. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway below, the beating of his own heart, the long-drawn rhythmic ah of the sea on the distant coast, all filled him with a sense of overwhelming mystery. And, as he read, the soft thud of a blinded moth, striking the wall above the candle, would make him start and listen like a creature of the woods at the sound of a cracking twig. The battered old book had the strangest fascination for him, though he had never quite grasped the thread of the story. It was called The Midnight Express, and there was one illustration, on the 50th page, at which he could never bear to look. It frightened him. Young Mortimer never understood the effect of that picture on him. He was an imaginative, but not neurotic youngster, and he avoided the 50th page as he might have hurried past a dark corner on the stairs when he was 6 years old, or as the grown man on the lonely road in The Ancient Mariner who, having once looked around, walks on, and turns no more his head. There was nothing in the picture, apparently, to account for this haunting dread. Darkness, indeed, was almost its chief characteristic. It showed an empty railway platform, at night, lit by a single dreary lamp, an empty railway platform that suggested a deserted and lonely junction in some remote part of the country. There was only one figure on the platform, the dark figure of a man, standing almost directly under the lamp with his face turned away towards the black mouth of a tunnel which, for some strange reason, plunged the imagination of the child into a pit of horror. The man seemed to be listening. His attitude was tense, expectant, as though he were awaiting some fearful tragedy. There was nothing in the text, so far as the child read, and could understand, to account for this waking nightmare. He could neither resist the fascination of the book, nor face that picture in the stillness and loneliness of the night. He pinned it down to the page facing it with 2 long pins, so that he should not come upon it by accident. Then he determined to read the whole story through. But, always, before he came to page 50, he fell asleep, and the outlines of what he had read were blurred, and the next night he had to begin again. And again, before he came to the 50th page, he fell asleep. He grew up and forgot all about the book and the picture. But halfway through his life, at that strange and critical time when Dante entered the dark wood, leaving the direct path behind him, he found himself, a little before midnight, waiting for a train at a lonely junction. And, as the station clock began to strike 12, he remembered like a man awakening from a long dream. There, under the single dreary lamp, on the long, glimmering platform, was the dark and solitary figure that he knew. Its face was turned away from him towards the black mouth of the tunnel. It seemed to be listening, tense, expectant, just as it had been 38 years ago. But he was not frightened now, as he had been in childhood. He would go up to that solitary figure, confront it, and see the face that had so long been hidden, so long averted from him. He would walk up quietly and make some excuse for speaking to it. He would ask it, for instance, if the train was going to be late. It should be easy for a grown man to do this, but his hands were clenched when he took the first step, as if he, too, were tense and expectant. Quietly, but with the old vague instincts awaking, he went towards the dark figure under the lamp, passed it, swung round abruptly to speak to it, and saw, without speaking, without being able to speak, it was himself, staring back at himself, as if in some mocking mirror, his own eyes alive in his own white face, looking into his own eyes, alive. The nerves of his heart tingled as though their own electric currents would paralyze it. A wave of panic went through him. He turned, gasped, stumbled, broke into a blind run, out through the deserted and echoing ticket office, onto the long moonlit road behind the station. The whole countryside seemed to be utterly deserted. The moonbeams flooded it with the loneliness of their own deserted satellite. He paused for a moment and heard, like the echo of his own footsteps, the stumbling run of something that followed over the wooden floor within the ticket office. Then he abandoned himself shamelessly to his fear and ran, sweating like a terrified beast, down the long white road between the two endless lines of ghostly poplars which answering each other, into what seemed like a long straight canal, in which one of the lines of poplars was again endlessly reflected. He heard the footsteps echoing behind him. They seemed to be slowly, but steadily, gaining upon him. A quarter of a mile away, he saw a small white cottage by the roadside, a white cottage with 2 dark windows and a door that somehow suggested a human face. He thought to himself that, if he could reach it in time, he might find shelter and security, escape. Thin, implacable footsteps, echoing his own, were still some way off when he lurched, gasping, into the little porch, rattled the latch, thrust at the door, and found it locked against him. There was no bell or knocker. He pounded on the wood with his fists until his knuckles bled. The response was horribly slow. At last, he heard heavier footsteps within the cottage. Slowly they descended the creaking stair. Slowly the door was unlocked. A tall, shadowy figure stood before him, holding a lighted candle, in such a way that he could see little either of the holder's face or form. But to his dumb horror there seemed to be a cerecloth wrapped around the face. No words passed between them. The figure beckoned him in, and, as he obeyed, it locked the door behind him. Then, beckoning him again, without a word, the figure went before him up the crooked stair, with the ghostly candle casting huge and grotesque shadows on the whitewashed walls and ceiling. They entered an upper room, in which there was a bright fire burning, with an armchair on either side of it, and a small oak table, on which there lay a battered old book, bound in dark red buckram. It seemed as though the guest had been long expected, and all things were prepared. The figure pointed to one of the armchairs, placed the candlestick on the table by the book, for there was no other light but that of the fire, and withdrew without a word, locking the door behind him. Mortimer looked at the candlestick. It seemed familiar. The smell of the guttering wax brought back that little room in the old Elizabethan house. He picked up the book with trembling fingers. He recognized it at once, though he had long forgotten everything about the story. He remembered the ink stain on the title page, and then, with a shock of recollection, he came on the 50th page, which he had pinned down in childhood. The pins were still there. He touched them again, the very pins which his trembling childish fingers had used so long ago. He turned back to the beginning. He was determined to read the end now, and discover what it was all about. He felt that it must all be set down there, in print, and, though in childhood he could not understand it, he would be able to fathom it now. It was called The Midnight Express, and, as he read the first paragraph, it began to dawn on him slowly, fearfully, inevitably. It was the story of a man who, in childhood, long ago, had chanced upon a book in which there was a picture that frightened him. He had grown up and forgotten about it, and one night, upon a lonely railway platform, he had found himself in the remembered scene of the picture. He had confronted the solitary figure under the lamp, recognized it, and fled in panic. He had taken shelter in a wayside cottage, had been led to an upper room, found the book waiting for him, and had begun to read it right through, to the very end, at last. And this book, too, was called The Midnight Express, and it was the story of a man who, in childhood, it would go on thus forever and forever and forever. There was no escape. But when the story came to the wayside cottage, for the 3rd time, a deeper suspicion began to dawn upon him. Slowly, fearfully, inevitably. Although there was no escape, he could at least try to grasp more clearly the details of the strange circle, the fearful wheel, in which he was moving. There was nothing new about the details. They had been there all the time, but he had not grasped their significance. That was all. The strange and dreadful being that had led him up the crooked stair, who and what was that? The story mentioned something that had escaped him. The strange host, who had given him shelter, was about his own height. Could that be he also? And this was why the face was hidden? At the very moment he asked himself that question, he heard the click of the key in the locked door. The strange host was entering, moving toward him from behind, casting a grotesque shadow, larger than human, on the white walls in the guttering candlelight. It was there, seated on the other side of the fire, facing him. With a horrible nonchalance, as a woman might prepare to remove a veil, it raised its hands to unwind the cerecloth from its face. He knew to whom it would belong, but would it be dead or living? There was no way out but one. As Mortimer plunged forward and seized the tormentor by the throat, his own throat was gripped by the same brutal force. The echoes of their strangled cry were indistinguishable, and when the last confused sounds died out together, the stillness of the room was so deep that you might have heard the ticking of the old grandfather clock and the long-drawn rhythmical ah of the sea on a distant coast, 38 years ago. But Mortimer had escaped at last. Perhaps, after all, he had caught the midnight express. It was a battered old book, bound in red buckram. The end. The Invisible Hand. I cannot pretend to explain away or account for the following incidents. I am not a fanciful or imaginative man, and if ever I thought of ghosts, or took part in any conversation of which they happened to be the topic, it was always to throw ridicule upon them. That I shall never do again. The skeptical reader may declare that what I am about to relate was the result of a dream or hallucination. I know that I was never in fuller possession of my waking senses, and that I actually saw and went through the following experience. It is now about 7 years ago since the announcement appeared in a local paper that Shufton Villa, a most desirable, excellently ventilated, and advantageously situated residence, was to be let. I had long been in search of a suitable house for myself and my family, and regularly every day had described a circuit of about 7 or 8 miles round the fair city of Exeter, with the most disheartening results. It was while plunged in despair at my non-success that the above advertisement one morning attracted the eye of my wife. We eagerly caught the prospect of such a solution to our difficulty. It seemed a blessing indeed after so much labor spent in vain. The preliminaries were arranged, and in due time we were installed in our new home. After about a week's sojourn, however, we began to be unpleasantly conscious that to the surrounding inhabitants, and the peasantry in particular, we were regarded with absorbing interest and curiosity, and it was not until Jane, one of our domestics, had captured the heart of a certain son of toil that any clue was afforded to the mystery. Then we learned for the first time since taking our new residence that it bore the reputation of being haunted. A former proprietor, so ran the story among the ignorant villagers, had surprised his daughter, one evening, inditing a loving epistle to the son of his enemy, had seized it over her shoulder, and after reading it, had compelled her to write another appointing a meeting in that room that very night. Providing himself with a pistol, the enraged father himself met the young lover, and after bestowing upon him many hot words, presented a loaded revolver at the young man's breast. This was probably done merely to intimidate the hero, but at that very moment the door was flung open by his daughter, who, taking in the terrible situation at a glance, cast herself upon the form of her lover. This seems to have turned the father's wavering purpose into a fixed determination. At any rate, whether from accident or design, the pistol went off, and before the wretched man's gaze, the next moment were the dying forms of his daughter and his enemy's son. Casting himself wildly before them in passionate grief, the terror-stricken father besought forgiveness. It was too late. No word escaped their cold lips, and ere he could summon assistance, he felt upon his brow the brand of Cain. That night the master of the house disappeared, and some fishermen, rowing on the river the following morning, discovered his body floating down with the tide. Thus ran this very tragic story, and, as it appeared on further inquiry, our new and enviable residence, unknown to us, had been let and relet again and again. On each occasion, the tenants had quitted it after a very short stay, from some unknown cause, and this had at last given the house the reputation of being in the possession of disembodied spirits. I was sitting, at 11:30, one night, in the latter part of February, in the room I used as my study, busily writing, when my mind in a careless fashion reverted to this superstition concerning Shufton village. I had not been thinking of the story, which seemed in some strange manner to be borne in upon my mind. My wife and children and our servants had retired to rest, and my thoughts were undisturbed by the slightest sound. All about the house was as silent as the grave. At the same moment that I began to recall the legend in the form in which it had reached me, it suddenly flashed across me that I was seated in the very room in which the terrible deed was said to have been enacted. I am by no means a superstitious man, but the dead silence in the house, and the wind moaning among the tall trees without, and the hollow ringing sound produced by my own footsteps whenever I moved to stretch myself, combined with the influence of the supposed witching hour, were calculated to produce a certain sensation of awe even in the most unimaginative of mortals. I again settled myself to my work, but I quickly discovered that it was almost impossible to divert my thoughts from the subject of the haunted room. My writing, a philosophical treatise I was preparing for a quarterly review, was spread out on the table before me, and I had leaned back upon my chair in a futile endeavor to get again into my train of thought, my eyes, meantime, being bent listlessly upon the paper. It was while gazing thus that, to my utter astonishment, I beheld the sheet slowly rise from the table and move in the direction of my shoulder, as if drawn there from behind me by some invisible hand. The lamp had burnt rather low, and a gentle, subdued light was in the room, and in it I saw distinctly the paper shake and quiver, but without a single rustle or noise of any kind, as if the hand that held it was violently trembling. I felt myself quite powerless either to move or utter a sound. My tongue became rooted in my mouth, and my hair seemed to assume a perpendicular position. By a great effort of will I pushed back the chair and rose from my seat, and the paper, as I did so, fell silently upon the table. I drew my handkerchief from my pocket and wiped my forehead, and walked round to where the lamp burned to turn it up. As I did so, my eyes fell upon the opposite side of the wall, and rested for a moment upon the portrait of the dead master of the house. I involuntarily shuddered, I knew not why, at the sight, and then my gaze dropped to the chair I had just quitted, and behind it I saw, with the utmost vividness, the outline of a human form. The features, as I looked, became plainly visible and were those of the picture on the wall. Transfixed to the spot, my hand resting upon the lamp, unable to move it up, I watched the countenance of the figure and saw that it was convulsed with rage and surprise. For a moment I thought a fearful gaze was fixed upon me, when its hand slowly rose and was shaken furiously at some invisible object apparently in the seat I had left. The expression next changed to one of intense malice and anticipated revenge, and the forefinger pointed to the paper on the table. Drawing a deep breath, I still gazed at my unearthly visitant. For the moment all fear had left me, and I waited calmly for what was to follow. I assert this most emphatically. From the gestures of the figure, there appeared to be another invisible personage in the room whom it was upbraiding. Suddenly a frightful change passed over the distorted features, and I beheld written upon them, as if it had been stamped in legible letters, the word murder. My lips tried to cry, "Forbear," but no sound escaped them. The horrible despair upon that face which followed, as succeeding some rash deed, was awful to witness, and it haunted me for many a long day after. The figure wrung its hands with a look of unspeakable agony, and to my horror was stealthily turning its eyes full upon me, when the lamp, which up to now had been burning low, suddenly went out and left me in total darkness. How long I stood there I know not, but at last, with a feeling of faintness, I groped my way to the door and made for my wife's room. She was awakened by my coming upstairs, and in wonderment beheld my staggering gait and pallid countenance, and looked with astonishment at the glass of brandy which I swallowed at a gulp. In less than a week our excellently situated and enviable residence had lost its tenants, and we were numbered amongst the panic-stricken occupiers of the past. Many times after our departure, I read that Shufton Villa was to be let, but the last time the announcement was varied. Through the medium of the same local paper, a paragraph informed me that Shufton Villa was to be pulled down and a church erected on the site out of the bounty of a lately deceased lord of the manor. The end.